research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. I extend a warm welcome to all of you to today's special panel discussion titled Archives and Their Significance in the Study of Foreign Policy and IR, the Contribution of AS Bhasin. Archival resources lie at the heart of rigorous scholarship in foreign policy and international relations. In this regard, the late Shri AS Bhasin made a remarkable contribution to the study of India's diplomatic history and its relations with neighboring countries, having made archival research in this field considerably more accessible than it had ever been before. Through his sustained and meticulous efforts, he compiled and published materials from the Historical Division of the Ministry of External Affairs, thereby transforming scattered official records into an accessible and coherent body of knowledge. His work has bridged the gap between policy and academia and has set a strong methodological foundation for archival research in India. Today's panel is both an academic conversation about the importance of archives and a tribute to the legacy he has left behind. Today, we have a very distinguished panel with us. Joining us are Ambassador Kishan S. Rana, Ambassador Ashok K. Kantha, Ambassador Yash Sinha, Ambassador TCA Raghavan, Professor Joe Thomas Karakat, Professor Avijit Banerjee, and Dr. Ritisha Mani Tiwari. Ambassador Kishan S. Rana is a former Indian Foreign Service officer and emeritus professor at Diplo Foundation, Malta and Geneva. He will speak on documents and archives in terms of modern maintenance. Ambassador Ashok K. Kantha is a former career diplomat who served as ambassador to China, Sri Lanka, and Malaysia. He is currently the Subhash Chandra Bose Chair Professor at Chanakya University and an honorary fellow at ICS. He will speak on AS Bhasin's documentation on China. Ambassador Yash Sinha is the president of the Association of Indian Diplomats. His presentation is titled Preserving Knowledge for Posterity, My Encounters with Shri AS Bhasin. Ambassador TCA Raghavan is a former High Commissioner to Pakistan and currently serves as adjunct professor at the School of Conflict and Security Studies, National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. He will speak on AS Bhasin's documentation on Pakistan and South Asia. Professor Joe Thomas Karakat is a professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Madras. He will speak on archival records and the imperative of transparency between privacy and preservation. Professor Avijit Banerjee is professor and head of the Department of Chinese Language and Culture at Vishwabharati University and an adjunct fellow at ICS. He will speak on importance of archives in the study of India-China relations. Dr. Ritisha Mani Tiwari is an assistant professor at Shahid Bhagat Singh College, University of Delhi, and an honorary fellow at ICS. She will speak on the role of archival research in the study of international relations. The session will be chaired by Professor Patricia Uberoy, who is an emeritus fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies and its former director and chairperson. Over the course of her distinguished academic career, she has held teaching and research positions at several leading institutions in India and abroad, including the Jawaharlal Nehru University, the University of Delhi, the Institute of Economic Growth, and the Australian National University, among others. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the discussion. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option, after which you will be called upon to unmute yourself. I now hand over to the chair. Over to you, Professor Oberoi.
Thank you very much, Harita. You've effectively done my job for me, introducing the panel, the speakers, and the rules. There's one thing that you didn't mention, that because we have so many people on the panel and limited time, we've been given more time than a usual Wednesday afternoon seminar. But nonetheless, the speakers are being given 8 minutes, and after that I will start making noises and looking fierce. So I think we should just, there's no need really for me to introduce the topic, except to say that it's a very delicate one. It's not only about collecting documents and putting them in a place, it's about deciding the rules of access, of transmission, of reproduction, and so on. So keeping archives is a sort of double-edged sword. It's very valuable and it's also very dangerous. So, or problematic, I should say. So all of that we all recognize and know, and the debate is going to continue on this subject towards the end. Now, I'm awfully impressed to say that our panel of discussants is really very distinguished. More than half of them hands-on diplomats who have wrestled with these questions in their own life during their own careers, and no doubt thereafter. But I think we should also remember, not go ahead without saying a final word about the person in whose name we are holding this meeting. This is Mr. Bhasin, Avtar Singh Bhasin, and he was not a person I knew very well. He was a person I recognized very well in the sense of being introduced to him in the IIC lounge, which he frequented very often along with his buddy, Kishan Rana, and a very genial, very quietly spoken man, obviously a man of opinions, but none that you ever heard from the next table to him. He was extremely kind, well-mannered, and available, if you like, for stray conversations along the way. There are several other reasons why I'm interested in his personal trajectory, but I'll come to those at the end. So meanwhile, I think we should leap straight in. I have a clock here. I won't set off the alarm, but I will try and remind everyone that we have limited time, but we'll get back to things in the long course. So here we are, we're dealing with a very important question in the name of a man who was a contributor to the archiving of India's external relations, and someone whose life work is we should pay real tribute and genuine tribute to, a beginner, a pioneer, and a gentleman. So now, without further ado, we proceed to our first speaker. So who is going first? Let me just make sure. Okay, of course. My old friend Kishan Rana. So Kishan Rana, I don't think needs further introduction, but he is someone who knows not only the subject, but also the personality on whose behalf we are here very, very well. And he always has something refreshing to say and something he likes a little bit of controversy. Let's see if he can do that today as well. So please go ahead, Ambassador Rana.
Thank you very much, Patricia. You're taking advantage of your chairmanship to land a few blows, which I welcome. Friends, I have a written text which I've abandoned. I really want to make 3 simple points. First, let's look at what other countries do with their archives. I have a limited amount of first-hand experience with British and American archives. The American archives, the archetype, the most prominent example is the US Library of Congress, which is an incredible collection of documents, published literature, etc. The British Archives, located near Kew Gardens, the famous Kew Gardens, is also very impressive. The common point between them is that everything in their archives is open and accessible to all. In addition, everything is available online, everything. Where they perhaps differ a little is that, to the best of my knowledge, what is in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. is available to all, free of charge, but that's my impression. At British Archives, shall we say, the smart British way of dealing with things, archival documents are priced. If you want to publish or use material from an archival document, you have to pay. Not a huge amount. But the best thing about these public archives is that when they are priced for access, which they are, in the case of Britain, British Archives is accessible to all. But if you go to Churchill Archives, built with public funds, but now in effect a private entity, and many other British archives, they will charge you money for access. It can be as much as 30,000 rupees a year or more. But then if a library or an institution subscribes to it, then the charges will be higher, but basically affordable. Now, is that a model that we should use? I'm not sure. I would rather go by the American model of leaving everything open and free. My second point, Indian archives and Indian handling of archives. The National Archives is our prime treasure house of archives. They have digitized everything, but they've not put it online as far as I know. And my knowledge, I must say, is not very complete on this. If they are putting things online, they are doing it fairly slowly. The other related issue is that the ministries, the public institutions that are supposed to transfer archival material to the National Archives don't always get around to doing it. There are many things to do, they have lots of work, and there are good reasons for this. But in effect, this means that up-to-date archival material is not available. And India applies the 30-year rule. So anything older than 30 years is mostly not for public access. My third point, and this would be a slightly longer one, is what Bhasin Saab did with archives. He began by publishing a yearbook for the Ministry of External Affairs. And that seemed very practical, very useful to everyone, because in one volume, you got all the key documents on foreign affairs. But somewhere he struck upon the idea of putting together country collections, that is, India's relations with Sri Lanka, for example, or with Nepal. And then, of course, the big countries, the important countries with extensive interactions, Pakistan, China, Bangladesh, etc. And he's covered a range of countries in the collections that he produced. I know there are my colleagues, former ambassadors, who are going to speak much more capably about how he went about gathering the material on Pakistan. But what I want to stress is that his method was collegial. He worked with people. He persuaded people to release documents. And he was helped by a number of heads of the Foreign Service, secretaries, additional secretaries, joint secretaries, directors, deputy secretaries, undersecretaries, ambassadors, deputy ambassadors, and the whole lot. And Bhasin Saab managed to seduce, sweet talk almost all of them in working with him. I mean, this was really a great personality. Bhasin Saab was my best friend since I retired from the service. And I say this without any embarrassment because he had been my guru when I joined the Northern Division in 1973. And for a year and a half, I was the nominal director and he was the nominal desk officer. But he was not just an equal, he was actually my teacher all the time. Now, what Bhasin Saab managed to do was a huge labor of love. I understand that, for example, the document, the original treaty between Nepal and India, he found on the floor of a storeroom in Kathmandu, literally on the floor. And there are many other stories that he could recount of documents that he rescued, documents that ministry colleagues helped him to rescue. I mean, all this was really a joint task. He didn't work alone. He worked with a whole bundle of people who worked with him. Now, Bhasin Saab had a quality of being able to work together with people, to persuade them, to cajole them, to charm them into putting together material and putting it out. The Pakistan collection, it is matchless. There is probably no two countries, sometimes friends, sometimes adversaries, sometimes at war with each other, for which such a complete set of documents has been put together as Bhasin Saab's 10-volume collection on Pakistan. But there are others who are far more competent to speak about that. China, again, he was able to access the material in the Prime Minister's Library, as it is now called, used to be the Nehru Library. But there, what he got was really P.N. Huxer's personal collection of papers. But even at that fine institution, our documents are not available through the internet. And this is a major step that Indian archives have to perhaps get round to doing. Patricia, I still have a moment or two. Okay. I just want to end by saying that the greatest act that Bhasin Saab could have done was to put everything out in the open. You know, he had problems with publishers. I won't name them, but these publishers hemmed and hawed and they said, documents, you know, who's interested in documents? So he started publishing them all by himself. And to put it very plainly, he made a ton of money out of it. And why not? He deserved it. I mean, every sense of the word. But right at the end, Bhasin Saab has put every one of the documents that he put together in the massive number of country collections is all out in public space, available for free download by anyone. And the website is known, it's published, and I hope very much that in the documents that the Institute of Chinese Studies puts together on today's meeting, they highlight in particular the place where all these documents are available free of cost. I mean, Bhasin Saab was a great man. He made good money out of it. But in the end, he said, what do I care about money? Make it available to all. I wish that spirit could animate us much more. There are many other documents in our collections that need to be opened up. I won't say more about it, but again, there are colleagues here who know more about that story than I do. The Association of Indian Diplomats has worked with the ministry in going through files, identifying the ones that are worth preserving, the ones that can be simply destroyed, the ones that are in between. So there again, there is a way of collegial action. And the External Affairs Ministry has shown through action, through leadership, that good things can be done by a ministry, even in a developing country, with limited resources, both material and human. Ultimately, it's human resources that count. Bhasin Saab was a great man. He was loved by everyone. He had no enemies, literally. He would talk to anyone. Anyone could stop him and say, I have this concern, I have this issue about India's relations with Malaysia. And do you think you can tell me? And he would fish out the connection, etc., etc. And then he took all these collections and started writing books based on his own collections. Bhasin साहब मुझे बहुत बहुत याद आते हैं. एक जिगर को दोस्त तो चला गया, लेकिन उनकी सुगंध हमारे पास काफी समय तक रहेगी. Thank you very much.
Ma'am, you are muted.
Sorry, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry for that. I think someone muted me, not me muted myself. Anyhow, I did want to say thank you very much for that personal and very substantial introduction to the man in whose honor we are coming together today. And we will hear more about that, but the lessons from his life are ones that we could all learn, listen to, and reflect upon. There's no doubt. And he must have been a great friend among so many friends. Now let us pass on to Ambassador Ashok Kant, who's speaking. Ashok, you had given a topic also somewhere, but just go ahead, introduce your topic, and
sure.
Look forward to hearing from you. The 8 minutes, I will try to be fair.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. It's difficult coming after Ambassador Kishan Rana because he really spoke so passionately about someone I also deem as a close friend. I'd known Bhasin Saab for more than 3 decades. But in recent years, we used to meet quite frequently at India International Center. We used to lunch together. In fact, he never allowed me to pay. And this generosity was also in his spirit. And as Master Rana brought out his act of making all his 40 volumes available beyond paywall, this will do great service to anyone who is interested in working on India's foreign policy. The panel today very rightly focuses on archives and their significance for the study of foreign policy and international relations. And there can be no better person around him to organize such a discussion. Bhasin Saab was, in a literal sense, a man who gave his life to the archives. He was, so passionately involved with archives that when he was 90, he was still working on his next book project, essentially utilizing documents he had collected. So whenever I go to IIC library, I always steal a glance at, the chair he used to occupy there. Something is missing. There's a big void for all of us. Patricia, topic assigned to me is his work on China. Arguably, this is the most contested file in India's post-independence foreign policy. And Bhasin Saab, sought to deal with it through a 5-volume, documentary study on India's relations with China. And this was indeed a monument of patient archival labor. The volumes cover in a very meticulous chronological sequence the full arc of the relationship from the early years of independence for India and liberation of or establishment of People's Republic of China, when both countries were animated by, spirit of Panchsheel, Asian solidarity, through the progressive deterioration relations, the catastrophe of 1962, long freeze that followed, and the painstaking process of normalization from Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's 1988 visit to Beijing. What makes this five-volume compilation exceptional is not just its scope, but its method. Bhasin Saab's approach was simple and relentless. Locate, verify, compile, and make accessible primary documents that would otherwise have remained scattered, buried in restricted collections, or invisible to researchers. As Master Rana mentioned, he worked tirelessly in Nehru Memorial Museum and Library and other repositories. And later, Indian Center was like his second home. The result is a documentary spine around which any serious study of India-China relations must be organized. I can say without hesitation that this five-volume study will remain an essential port of call for any researcher interested in India-China relations because they cover, diplomatic notes, bilateral correspondence, summit communiques, parliamentary records, white papers, and all assembled in a very meticulous manner, contextualized. So he has, given this material for researchers. Now it's up to researchers to do what they want to do with that material. Let me turn to one point, one aspect of these volumes, which really make them come alive, which illuminate sort of essence, value of the volumes. And that is, India-China boundary question, something which is possibly the most complex and consequential territorial disputes in post-colonial world. And if you're trying to understand that, Bhasin Saab's contribution in putting together all the relevant material, and much of this material was not really available in public domain. Ambassador Rana referred to P.N. Huxer collection. Even, getting access to P.N. Huxer collection, and not only P.N. Huxer collection, but whole lot of other, private repositories. This was Bhasin Saab's unique personality, his, track record, his credentials, which made doors open for him. He could really cajole and persuade people to make these documents available. But for him, in fact, many of these documents would remain hidden, not available to researchers. In fact, I recall when I was retiring, I was wondering that papers like those documents on Zhou Enlai's visit, they were all classified top secret. That now I will not have security clearance. I will not be able to see them again. Something was seriously missing. But then Bhasin Saab's volume, they're all available. And that also, in fact, answers certain doubts we had. When I was Director China, Joint Secretary East Asia, we argued that we should not declassify some of those documents because that will affect our negotiating position vis-a-vis China. But declassification of documents which are available in P.N. Huxer collection or other private repositories made available in public domain by Bhasin Saab hasn't really damaged or undermined position. So many of those apprehensions we had earlier were really ill-founded. I will not go into specifics of visit because Patricia will start looking at her clock. I will just make couple of other points. One point is that P.N. Huxer collection becoming available to Bhasin Saab was accidental. In fact, he had related to me in some detail that how he got access to P.N. Huxer collection. And that also raises a very troubling question. Should we get access to documents which are absolutely essential for understanding that period, just because we had an outstanding archivist in Bhasin Saab, just because he had a power of persuasion of very high order, or should these things be based on a more greater transparency norms, where these documents are routinely made available unless there are some specific concerns. This brings me to India's declassification deficit, something that Ambassador Rana has referred to. One can say without any hesitation, unfortunate truth is that India's declassification and public records release process is among the most restrictive in the democratic world. Not just democratic world. In fact, you look at Soviet archives which have been made public. It's amazing, kind of documentation, say on 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which are available in public domain now. Whereas in our case, especially when it comes to China and Kashmir, our declassification process remains extremely negative, rigid, and rule of thumb is deny rather than make available. I think this creates, a sort of strategic liability. And comparison can be made, as Rana Saab did, with, practices being followed in other countries, whether it be UK or USA or Australia, where 30-year rule or sometimes 20-year rule is being followed. Whereas in our case, the Public Records Act of 1993 and Public Records Rules of 1997 provide a framework for management of official records, but this framework is not being pursued. At least in case of China, I can say that the default position is deny rather than give access to sensitive material. Problem is really acute in case of China. And I will, in fact, recommend, we have with us, President of Association of Indian Diplomats, Yash Sinha. I will strongly recommend that AID should start a dialogue with government on this issue, that we need to revisit some of the restrictions which are in place. We should not be made to be dependent on partial, accidental release or declassification of papers, dependent on individual personalities or institutional circumstances. It should be something where we should be following certain norms as other major countries do. Why we should be an exception, this is something really beats me. I will conclude here by just making one point that this is again generosity of spirit of Bhasin Saab. Last two books of his which came out, he had asked me to be a discussant. And the last book was on landmark agreements that came out. In my remarks, in fact, I disagreed quite strongly with Bhasin Saab on some of the points he had made in the book. And in fact, he didn't seem to mind at all. I refer to lunches we used to have. There was much we agreed upon, but there were many issues on which we had disagreement. But kind of person he was, he never took exception to that. So that kind of, approach, attitude generosity that Bhasin Sahab showed, he really was the gold standard. Gold standard also in terms of his commitment to continue to work as long as he can. That's why even when he turned 90, he was working on his next project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, for your input into this, both personal and very professional. So I think we must pass on now to the next speaker, who will be Ambassador Yash Sinha. Ambassador Sinha.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Professor Dr. Oberoi. Eminent panelists indeed. I was a bit surprised when I was asked to participate in this panel discussion, special panel discussion, because I think I'm probably the least qualified among the panelists to be speaking on archives and archival material, because I've not really written, I'm not really an author. I've written, apart from a few articles, I haven't really written any books. In fact, among the four siblings, I'm the least qualified. I have two younger sisters, one the Alison Freeman Palmer Professor of History at the University of Michigan in Connecticut, in Ann Arbor, and the second, the James and Shirley Draper Chair of American History at the University of Connecticut in Hartford. Perhaps I should have taken some tips from them before appearing before you. But since, at my capacity as president of the Association of Indian Diplomats, which, as Ambassador Rana mentioned earlier, has been involved in working with Mr. Bhasin in trying to document certain important phases in our relationship with our neighbors and other countries too. I have personally, of course, been involved in the sense that the first time I encountered Mr. Bhasin was way back in 1992, when I was the Deputy Secretary in the Pakistan desk in the Ministry of External Affairs. He came into my room looking rather harried, looking for the text of the Nehru-Liaquat Pact. And for the life of me, I didn't know where to find the exact text. And then we managed to go down to the division and locate it after a great deal of search. But that was his zeal, and later on I benefited from his 10 volumes. In fact, the 10 volumes on India-Pakistan relations, I think was finally published around 2012, 2013, when I was heading the Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran division. But I subsequently went to Sri Lanka, and I found the 5 volumes that he had written on India-Sri Lanka relations and the ethnic conflict that he documented, was extremely useful. So, I mean, we've all had our experiences in terms of finding the archival material that he used and that he used to document various agreements with various countries. But I'm not going to take too much time, but before I conclude, I would like to point to one incident which actually makes me reasonably qualified to appear in front of you, is because in 2010, in response to a RTI, a Right to Information application by a famous journalist, Indian journalist, on the Swaran Singh Bhutto talks on Kashmir, I was asked by my Foreign Secretary to appear in front of the Chief Information Commissioner and another commissioner, division bench of the CIC, to defend not parting with the files and the documents contained therein. Of course, we did finally succeed, much to the chagrin of this late famous journalist, but I didn't realize that 9 years later, I would be sitting on the other side as the Chief Information Commissioner, actually adjudicating matters, including those of the Ministry of External Affairs on documentation, etc. And my job was try to ensure that the citizenry, the public, gets access to as much information as can be parted with. And that surely was a challenge, not just with the Ministry of External Affairs, but with all wings of the government. Because as you're aware, governments are very reluctant to part with information, not only in India, but elsewhere in the world. So I think what is being suggested, and I take on board what Ambassador Kantha mentioned, that the AID should be involved in some way in trying to help the Ministry of External Affairs in one, perhaps, not just digitization, which is already happening, but also to see how certain papers can be declassified and made available to scholars, research scholars, academics, and to the general public. But this is going to be a challenge. It's something that the AID would be happy to engage with people who are familiar with this subject and can advise on how we can proceed. With these words, I'd like to conclude. Thank you, the Institute of Chinese Studies, for inviting me. And I have very fond memories of Mr. Bhasin, though I've met him not so frequently. But whenever I did, I was struck by his sincerity of purpose and his dedication. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sinha. And we now come to Ambassador TCA Raghavan. Very welcome to see you again after some time. And I don't have a topic for you, a specific topic for your presentation, but please go ahead and introduce yourself and it.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Oberoi, for inviting me, and I've greatly benefited from the three comments made so far. I too had a long association with Mr. Bhasin for over 30 years in different capacities, but especially in the past few years since retirement, I had got to know him quite well, and we used to spend a lot of time together. Now, I don't want to repeat all that was said by Ambassador Rana and Ambassador Kantha and finally by Yash Sinha. I would like to say that I agree with them entirely about Bhasin Saab's drive, his energy, his great sense of friendship, that great air of courtesy with which he conducted all his discussions. All of that I recall most warmly. I would instead like to speak a little bit about two aspects which I think are very important when we examine the legacy of Mr. Bhasin. The first is the fact that he joined the Ministry of External Affairs as part of an institution which, towards Mr. Bhasin's own service career, became defunct, which was the historical division of the Ministry of External Affairs. Now, we tend to overlook the fact that the setting up of the historical division in the Ministry of External Affairs was seen almost as a kind of adjunct to the establishment of the Indian Foreign Service itself. And they more or less took place at the same time in 1948 or 49, because at that time, the view was very clear that the Ministry of External Affairs had to have an institutional sense of where it was coming from, and that it needed to create a division which would act as the repository of its institutional history. And for a period of about 2 decades after that, the historical division was at the heart of many of the things which the MEA did, especially with regard to the neighborhood. Thereafter, it went into a slump, and sometime in the late 1980s, the historical division, most unfortunately, I think it was a wrong decision, it was wound up. Now, Bhasin Saab, when he retired, I think he took it upon himself to try to continue to do the kind of things which he felt the historical division should have been doing, which is collecting documents, presenting them to the public, organizing them in a way which would encourage future scholarship, because all of that is part of the wider exercise of building up a country's narrative. Now, there are, of course, many precedents, and Ambassador Rana mentioned some of them. The United States, with its Office of the Historian, is clearly the world leader in terms of the kind of historical approach which the Department of State has. It's a different matter that they don't internalize or follow what their own research throws up. But the Office of the Historian and the documents which they bring out, which are called, it's a series called the Foreign Relations of the United States, is now over 150 years old. Similarly, the British, the German, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, for instance. The Iranians, to my great surprise, I have found that the Iranians have possibly the only museum of diplomatic history which exists today in any foreign office. I think Bhasin Saab's entire endeavors, especially the volumes which he brought out with regard to Pakistan and China in particular, really point to a big institutional gap in the Ministry of External Affairs, which is the historical division. And I think something should be done about it in institutional terms, because no amount of ad hoc or approaches would really solve that problem. And the problem really is also what Ambassador Kantha identified, which is the declassification deficit. You know, we can't jugaad our way out of this declassification deficit. You need an institutional system which will look at the historical files, the historical record, and see how can they be made available, if they are to be made available to the public. The P.N. Huxter papers or the T.N. Call papers in the Teen Murti, in the Prime Minister's Museum and Library also raises very difficult questions, because these are not, they are private collections, but they are private within quotes. What the late Mr. Huxter and the late Mr. Call did was that they kept copies of, or they kept sometimes the originals of all the papers that passed through their respective desks, kept it with them, and later on, many years after they retired, they deposited it in the Prime Minister's Museum and Library, or the Teen Murti Library. So it was a kind of ad hoc arrangement, and which is why their declassification or enabling access to them was so difficult. Because in many ways, the fact that the act of their being sent to the Prime Minister's Museum and Library was itself somewhat in a kind of gray zone of legality in terms of office procedures. I think the only way out of these questions is for a proper institutional system which will be the guardian of the historical record of the Ministry of External Affairs, and which will thereafter turn that record into an archive which can be accessed by scholars. If I have another couple of minutes, I can make one final point. I think the other point which I worked quite closely with Mr. Bhasin from 2007 when we were declassifying the Pakistan papers, which he used in his fantastic 10-volume collection on Pakistan. But it was quite an extraordinary effort in many ways, because that was precisely the time when the Ministry of External Affairs had embarked on what was possibly the most ambitious digitization project undertaken by any foreign ministry. And this was done in the early years of this century, when a vast extent of the archive or the historical records of the Ministry of External Affairs were digitized. Now, it was meant to be a first step towards their being handed over to the National Archives, but also in parallel being available in the Ministry of External Affairs. But unfortunately, that project has lost a great deal of its momentum. Some of the software which was used to digitize has got corrupted. That kind of older access which was available has got severely constrained, which again, I think, points at the requirement of an institutional arrangement which is better served to developing the historical memory of the Ministry of External Affairs. I'll stop with that, and thank you very much again for inviting me.
Thank you, Ambassador Raghavan. Very interesting and useful inputs into the discussion. So now we move to the first academic among us, Professor Joe Thomas Karakatur. Are you there, Joe? Yes, I can see you.
Yes.
Please go ahead and please tell us what you're going to talk about.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Oberoi, and thank you to the ICS for including me in this panel. Allow me a moment to please share my presentation. Yeah, is the presentation visible?
Yes, it is. Go ahead.
Right. So I would be speaking on archival records and the imperative of transparency, where I look at some of the challenges I have faced as a researcher or PhD students have faced whenever we deal with the custodian of archives, oscillating between privacy concerns and between preservation concerns. The context for the remarks would be some of the works that we've undertaken in recent years, which has involved sustained and immersive engagement with archival material. These works, both single-authored and jointly authored with my PhD students, have covered a range of topics that dealt with different aspects of the India-China boundary dispute, and also aspects of diplomatic history linking southern India and China. And besides conventional published work, there are also two non-fiction research films which relied heavily on archival material. My initial remark is that archives are extremely important to build public trust. So for instance, researchers accessing archives, besides looking for an unbroken chain of official government decisions, documentation relating to government communication or other actions, archives have also proven to be excellent repositories of rare books and manuscripts, which are vital not just for researchers, but for any informed citizen to form their own view on issues that affect them. So for instance, a late 19th century document, such as the one on your screens now, the Gazetteer of Kashmir and Ladakh, it gives the reader a fair bit of detail on the status of present-day sites. So just to sort of read an excerpt that I've pulled out from this Gazetteer, and if you can just read along, writing in 1875, Mr. Drew, who was for some time the Maharaja's governor of Ladakh, stated that from the Kunlun Mountains southwards to the head of the Changchangmo Valley, the boundary between Ladakh and Tibet is quite doubtful. From the head of the Changchangmo Valley to the south and southwest till Gya Peak is reached, the boundary appeared to be fairly well understood as representing actual occupation. And if you look at the closing line, in the neighborhood of the Pangong Lake, Mr. Drew observes, there have been boundary disputes which may now be said to be latent. So of course, those of us who are familiar with present-day sites post-Galwan, such as Gogra Post and the Gogra Hot Springs area, which was a major flashpoint in 2020, are able to sort of, surmise that this issue of unresolved boundaries is something that cannot be attributed to the leadership of a newly independent India, for instance. So to that extent, I felt that archives can actually help the government of the day to build trust at the public level to take bold decisions, right? Of course, if there is a will. Archives also provide verifiable records that can support accountability and also preventing repetition of errors. So the narrative on the Simla conference, for instance, is a case in point, which completely shifts the understanding on the drawing of boundary lines between India and China, oftentimes pulling in both the custodian of the archives and the user into an ethical dilemma concerning research integrity versus the preferred historical narrative that is to be put out. So are we to understand that the definition of the eastern sector of our boundary with China achieved some sense of finality with what the Simla conference achieved? Or do the archives reveal a completely different reality? So if you look at the portions relating to the primary documentation covering the expansive period from 1913 to 1915, oftentimes we find that it is these kind of concerns that give rise to situations that involve many a times withholding information, especially withholding what is inconvenient, either by denial or by deferring access to the material. And many a times researchers with limited time, beyond a few weeks or months, they are forced to make do with whatever they can access. Of course, here it is important to remind that researchers should not give up. Upholding intellectual honesty is paramount. Again, manipulating findings in social sciences to meet X or Y objective or narrative is no different from how it is seen in pure sciences if a scientist were to manipulate findings. So researchers have to find ways to overcome these gaps in official archives, whether it relates to denial or delay. And this can be done often by cross-referencing the missing links from other repositories so that they can, in a way, infer the chain of events that is being studied. I should also add that archives are a fascinating treasure trove of newer research possibilities, partly because of the process involved in generating archival content. So as some of our speakers mentioned, before being sent to departmental archives and ultimately to the National Archives, usually the process is guided by a certain record retention schedule for categories of documents, and it takes between 25 to 30 years before it gets transferred to the National Archives. So this means that research on topics which might seemingly have been exhaustively dealt by stalwarts such as Parshottam Mehra, Karunakar Gupta, A.G. Nurani, etc., would still have ample opportunity for later scholars to gather newer insights based on material that might have been classified at a later point in time and transferred to the archives. The other issue that I mentioned in my opening comments was the issue relating to the lack of access owing to preservation concerns. And on your screen to your right are Kerala palm leaf manuscripts. These are preserved using traditional oils, specifically neem oil, lemongrass oil, citronella oil, that prevents damage from fungi and insects. These oils are applied to clean, condition, and protect the fragile leaves, and this helps them survive for roughly 400 to 800 years. The Taliola Grantha that you can see on your screen, again, recorded knowledge using a metal stylus called as a Narayam in Malayalam. And this again represents a 600-year-old tradition. To the left of your screen, again, is brittle communication, again relating to a work that we were engaged in at a much later point of time. And this communication relates to jail records. And here it discusses the need to stop sending Malay and Chinese convicts to Tamil Nadu in 1866. So the point here is that on the preservation side also, there are genuine concerns as far as accessing material is concerned. In conclusion, I'd like to sum up by saying that we have to sort of deal with the tendency to overclassify and selectively release document access in a positive manner because this tendency tends to distort the view that researchers genuinely get into the past. There might be a range of solutions that actually exist beyond bureaucratic silos that could offer an eclectic set of inputs into an existing research problem. But the fact that the information that actually offers a solution to a research problem might only be deferred or handed over, given the record retention schedule and the handover formalities, etc., it might only be handed over to the next generation, by which time it might actually develop into a different kind of problem for the whole society. Therefore, again, reiterating the point that it creates a distorted view of the past. So going back to my initial topic, there is a need to balance the imperative of transparency between a privacy paranoia and, of course, genuine preservation concerns. Also, we need to focus on time-bound availability of digital surrogates. So whether it is microfilms, whether it is OCR-enabled scans or images, we need to sort of work on this in order to overcome the problem of fragile documents, etc. And with evolving technology, with the use of AI-enabled research, access to these archives in a digital form would allow researchers access to troves of information at a single point in time, if, of course, they're made accessible in digital form. So on that note, I'll bring my presentation to a close, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for that presentation. I think dealing not only with the privacy aspects, but with the technical aspects of maintaining an archive physically, in what form and how, and so on, and also for linking it up with processes of research and teaching, enabling young scholars to actually immerse themselves in the physical reality of archives and archival research. Anyone who's done this can verify that it's a very, very exciting business when people discover new things in archives that they didn't know existed or didn't know contained that sort of material. So thank you for linking up with the pedagogic aspect as well as the preservation of really valuable materials, in which, as was said in the introduction, I think, by Ambassador, was said originally, that a lot of people are not actually very careful about the physical presentation of the archives, of archival material. Anything might happen. So thank you, that's very good. Now, we come now to Avijit Banerjee. Avijit, yes, you're right there. Please tell us what you're going to talk about.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor Oberoi, and thanks, Professor Alka Acharya and the ICS team for inviting me in this panel. So I will just try to talk about some of why the archives are important in unearthing the history of India-China relations, and also try to talk about the Indian origin Chinese in Kolkata. Now, these archives are unique laboratories of history where diplomatic documents become witness of eras and tools for understanding the logic of international relations. No subject on politics and diplomacy is complete without a reference to archival sources, for they allow us to reconstruct the true fabric of events. The archival materials reproduce the real state of international communication, the hidden intentions and compromises behind the grand declarations and diplomatic gestures. Today, the importance of archives is rapidly growing. In this era of digital world, archives guarantee the factual accuracy and the key to an objective understanding of the past. Now, here I want to mention about the Indian-Chinese origin in Kolkata. One who wants to pursue study on this topic might go for interviews with some of the very old Chinese who are still there in Kolkata, although most of the Chinese who are staying in Kolkata, the 20,000 Chinese roughly, has now come down to 2,000, as especially after the COVID, most of them had been to Taiwan, Australia, Canada, and in these places. Now, if you go to interview them, they are not willing to give the interviews. There is an online forum called All India Chinese Association where you will not get much of the history of this society. Some of the events they are only mentioning about that, for example, the Chinese New Year and all these things. Now, there is also a story about how the Chinese came. Some of these stories are being transmitted from one generation to another, saying that there was a shipwreck and a Chinese sailor who survived it became a sugar trader in Bengal. although this is being some kind of the official, the Chinese consulates, the ministries, they also try to establish this story. This is a story of Tong Achu or Tom Achi. Now, it is also not sure whether these are two persons or one person. However, there are interesting tales about this character. Some of the material suggests that this Achu was engaged in sugar and tea trading. It became so popular that the then Governor General of British India granted land to Achu to build and run a sugar factory near the outskirts of Kolkata called Baj. The most interesting is that if we go to that place, you will find a temple. However, this temple was established not, this is a story 300 years back, but this temple was established 150 years ago. You will find a tomb of this person which is almost 300 years back. So these are very interesting things about the origin. Now, here one need to locate public records of both the colonial and the post-colonial period to understand how the presence of the community had been represented. It is important to see how the Chinese community spread and made home for itself in the colonial capital of Kolkata. Alongside, it was also important to see what happened within a decade of Indian independence when they were forced to go through surveillance, deportation, and loss of rights to citizenship. Bengal Gazette and newspapers that covered the war period of 62. One can go through this. Both sets of public records were available in the National Library in Kolkata. The Gazette threw up various references to Chinese people settling down in the city, working in the port, and working as carpenters. The archival data highlight the fact that the Chinese were seen as highly efficient workers, especially when it came to large-scale wood-working projects. In contrast, the British were also suspicious of the community as they maintained a very inward life which the colonialists wished to penetrate. Now, another set of archival material is there besides this Bengal Gazette. That is the British established IB of India, the oldest equivalent to secret services in a colonial nation state. Now, some entries in the IB files would regularly portray Teriti Bazaar, the site of the first and oldest Chinatown in the city of Kolkata, as a source of threat, and the local government officials and municipal authorities were asked to keep a close watch on the homes and workplace of the Chinese. The point is that if you want to get access to these archives, it's a huge, long process, and normally the scholars leave the things without going to this place because the permissions and which the other speakers have also mentioned. Now, besides this, if we are looking for the India-China pursuing research on the India-China relations, many of the scholars have just mentioned that there are National Archives of India and the Manuscripts Department of the Nehru Memorial and Library. The National Archives of India holds a rich collection of documents concerning relations with China during the British India government period. Important contents including visits to China by Indian leaders such as Tagore and Nehru, relations between Indians and Chinese Communist Party, Indian aid to China during the War of Resistance against Japan, intelligence reports from British India consulates in China to the UK. Now, the National Archives of India's on relations with China after India's independence in 1947, aside from some earlier files of the East Asia Division of the Ministry of External Affairs, primarily consist of annual and monthly reports from the Indian Embassy in China, Consulate in Shanghai, Consulate in Lhasa, and the Consulate in Hong Kong. And also there are many other things here. The Nehru documents contain core archives on India-China relations, including reports and instructions from the 49 Sino-Indian negotiations on establishing diplomatic relations and the exchange of ambassadors, documents from 51 to 54 concerning India's mediation of the Korean War and the repatriation of prisoners of war, summary reports from Chou En-lai's 54 visit to India and Nehru's 1954 visit to China, documents from 54 Sino-Indian negotiations on the Tibet Local Trade and Commerce Agreement, and a lot. Now, here I also want to mention about the UK National Archives collection of Sino-Indian relations archives, which has several notable characteristics. First, it contains a large number of declassified documents of more than 540 volumes. 122 are declassified, including 29 top secret, 27 confidential, and 66 secret. This is relatively a high proportion compared to other countries worldwide. It can be said that for anyone seeking fruitful research on major issues such as the roots of the Sino-Indian border issues, especially Shimla Conference, so-called McMahon Line, the factors influencing its development, the causes and impacts of Sino-Indian border standoffs, frictions and conflicts, India's stance on the Sino-Indian border issue, and the understanding of the development of Sino-Indian relations, these archives are really indispensable. I also want to finally conclude on the fact that archives these days are also playing a special role as a soft power, influencing the formation of a country's image through scientific and cultural interaction. The publication of documents previously inaccessible to the public strengthens a country's reputation as open and democratic and demonstrates a willingness to engage in international dialogue. Archival diplomacy thus serves as a tool for strengthening international prestige and intellectual cooperation. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Abhijit, for that. An unusual presentation, a historical dimension, a regional dimension, and raising many problems of interpretation as well. Now, as our final speaker, we pass on to Dr. Ritusha Mani Tiwari and request her to. Ritusha, what is the theme of your presentation? Tell us that first.
So I'm looking at rethinking archives from sources to structures.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a privilege to be a part of this panel hosted by the Institute of Chinese Studies, reflecting on archives and their significance in the study of foreign policy and IR in memory of Mr. Avtar Singh Bhasin. Since I'm speaking at the very end, I want to draw together some threads and perhaps gently push the discussion in a slightly conceptual direction. I will make three brief moves. First, to rethink what we mean by archives in IR. Second, to situate AS Bhasin's contribution. And third, to reflect on what this means for how we do international relations. So in the first part of my presentation, I'm looking at rethinking archives from sources to structures. In conventional IR, archives are treated as sources, repositories of data that help us reconstruct what happened. But archives are not merely sources. They are also structures of knowledge. They determine what can be seen, what can be known, what can be asked, and what remains outside the field of inquiry. And in this sense, archives are epistemic infrastructures, which are shaped by power through classification, preservation, and omission. This insight resonates with Michel Foucault's understanding of the archives, not as a collection of documents, but as the system that governs what can be said. So when we enter an archive, we are not simply accessing history. We are entering a field of power, knowledge, relations. So to put it simply, archives do not just record diplomacy, they help produce what counts as diplomacy. And in this broader framework, I would now attempt to locate AS Bhasin as an archivist, as an editor, as an interpreter. It is in this context that Bhasin's work becomes extremely significant. Positioned within the historical division of the MEA, he was not just a user of archives, but also a builder of archives. Through his documentary compilation, he collected, curated, annotated, and framed documents for future scholarships, which is extremely crucial because he was not simply recovering history, but was structuring the archives through which history would be studied. And in this sense, his role also reflects what the Jacques Derrida's tradition or Derridian tradition describes as the archonistic function, that is the authority not just to preserve, but to organize and interpret the archive. So, which takes us this whole idea that beyond empiricism, there is a possibility of a documentary interpretive tradition. So at first glance, when we look at the huge body of work that Bhasin has left behind, this work appears to belong to a classical empiricist tradition focused on primary documentation and chronology. But archives do not assemble themselves. They involve selection, ordering, contextualization, and narration. So as E.H. Carr reminds us, facts do not speak for themselves. They become meaningful only through selection and interpretation. So Bhasin is not merely a compiler. He is also an interpreter of what got selected, what got ordered, in what context, and how it was further narrated. We can therefore place his work in a documentary interpretive tradition between positivist empiricism and critical analysis. That brings me to the next part of my presentation, which is archives as text, the question of reading. From a critical perspective, the archive itself is a text. Documents are written with intent, addressed to specific audiences, embedded in strategic and bureaucratic language. They do not speak, they must be read. And this reading is layered. The archivist is the first interpreter. The scholar who is reading the work of the archivist is the second interpreter. Here, Hayden White's insight becomes extremely relevant, that even historical material is shaped by narrative structuring. Even documentary collections are not neutral. They are already partially organized into some sort of meaning. And in this sense, Bhasin's work shapes the terrain on which interpretation becomes possible. Now, that brings me to the next part, which is enabling critical and post-colonial IR, what it does to how we read and understand and subsequently study IR. So from a critical and post-colonial international relations perspective, Bhasin's contribution is particularly significant. IR for long has relied on Western archives, Western categories, Western narratives. Bhasin's work provides a systematic archive of Indian diplomatic practice, enabling A, reconstruction of Indian foreign policy thinking, B, tracing of indigenous strategic vocabularies, and C, challenging epistemic hierarchies. So even if not framed as critical theory, works such as that of A.S. Bhasin's enable critical IR. It creates the material basis for epistemic diversification. Now, the question that can be raised here is, are there limits and silences of archives, even in this diversified epistemic possibility? So the answer to that would be yes. At the same time, when we are attempting epistemic diversification, even then archives could and many a times do remain selective. They privilege official voices, elite actors, formal diplomacy, which goes on to exclude the subaltern perspective, the gendered experience, or everyday practices, which basically goes on to raise a deeper question, echoing what Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak says, that not just that can the subaltern speak, but can the subaltern be archived? So the task is not just to use archives, but to read them with and against the grain, to attend to both the presences and the absences. In terms of my concluding reflections, let me conclude with a set of final thoughts. If Michel Foucault was reminding us that archives are what structure the discourse, and Derrida was saying that they would embody authority, and E.H. Carr would say that facts require interpretation, then A.S. Bhasin's work sits at the intersection of all these three. In international relations, theory shapes how we interpret the world, but archives shape what world is available to interpret. And in that sense, Bhasin's contribution is foundational. He did not simply document India's foreign policy, he structured the archive through which it could be studied, debated, and reinterpreted in selective portions that he worked on. And perhaps the most meaningful tribute that we can offer is this, to treat archives not as fixed repositories of truth, but as living sites of inquiry, open to reinterpretation, contestation, and critical engagement. And in that sense, archives don't just preserve the past, they delimit what can be known about it. And in shaping that horizon, AS Bhasin helped define a the very field of Indian IR. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Rutusha, for a very cerebral and also a very practical look at the work of Bhasin and in general, the whole project of archiving with reference to our discussion. Now, I think we have very little time, but we were meant to have a conversation across the participants, asking each other or adding to other people's work. Would anyone like to come in here among the speakers, and then we can just briefly, and then we can look at open to the floor more generally. Any hands up? Abhijit, are you wanting to?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Just thing is that there is a question here. So, saying that how can we academically validate their lived experiences and oral traditions as a primary source of India-China historical studies? And furthermore, does the lack of official documentation? Actually, the problem is that archival that I have talked about, that this IB documents which are there, it's really very difficult to access those documents. Now, the another thing, if one scholar is pursuing these studies on the Chinese, the local Chinese in Kolkata or for their history, then you have to mix up with these people. If you mix up with these people, there is one way that unless you are becoming friendly, because after 62, these Chinese have changed a lot. Their mindset have changes because after 62 has shaken them. And the COVID is another factor which really a great loss for many Chinese lost their lives. So the first thing is that you can, one who is pursuing research on this, they can go to National Library. There you can get some kind of this archival documents, the Bengal Gazette, and you have to try to access these IB documents, which will help you at least in some way to trace the history of these people. And the third one is to mix up with them, to stay them and friends with them. You will be surprised to know that there are two very clubs there, and these clubs every Sunday they had a meeting in these clubs. These are the Chinese clubs, and there are few Indians who are very close to them. I have one friend, and who every Sunday they go to that club. And in India, only one breakfast market is there from 6 to 7 o'clock. This market, they will get all sorts of Chinese thing in Kolkata on Sunday. So these are some of the things which those who want to get research, they have to go there, try to access the archives, and also mix with these people to find out the roots of this origin.
Okay, Ambassador Rana, would you like to come in here?
Yes. Patricia.
Yes.
Can I be heard?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Patricia, to say this truthfully, I know documentary research is expensive, particularly if it involves international travel. And research funds in India are always terribly, terribly limited. But still, let me ask a simple question. Why did it take a stupid former diplomat to wander into the British National Archives, ask for papers on Churchill's correspondence with Jinnah, and locate a letter that Jinnah wrote on the 2nd of January 1941. 2nd of January 1941. And it was followed up by 2 telegrams from Jinnah and a response from Leo Amery, Secretary of State for India, also by telegram. So this entire short little trail of papers was sitting there in the British National Archives, and nobody had even bothered to go and ask. Now, when I presented these documents at the Churchill Archives, they were astonished and slightly dismayed. Astonished because they didn't know about this paper, dismayed because they didn't have it. And it was not among the papers that the great Winston Churchill had transferred to Churchill Archives. Now, the bottom line in this is that Winston Churchill carried out a careful weeding of his papers before they were handed over. And his correspondence with Jinnah was so explosive, even in 1971, when he transferred those papers, 71, he did not want those papers to go. How did British Archives have them? Because the same man, Churchill, had circulated these papers to the entire British cabinet to say, look, I'm in correspondence with Jinnah. And one of the copies of those survived in the British National Archives. I could go on this because I'm going to write an article on this actually. But I just want to say, does it not show a great deal of lethargy on the part of our researchers? Thank you very much.
Well, that was an interesting input into the history of Churchill in India. Thank you very much. There are some questions in the chat box. Could someone read them out, please?
Yes.
Rita, you're there. Thank you. Please do.
So this one is from Venkatraman KK, who is a PhD candidate at OP Jindal Global University. So he says, while I agree in principle with Ambassador Kantha's comments that archival material should be declassified at regular intervals without requiring someone of the stature of Bhasin Saab's persuasion, my question is, are we as a democracy mature enough to learn the lessons and move on, or will it just be another set of issues to fight amongst ourselves?
So response to that?
Let me just respond briefly to Venkat's point. Issue is that when papers are declassified, not people are actually paying attention. Like it contains a whole lot of material, as I mentioned earlier, that was available. There's a special section in Ministry of External Affairs where the most sensitive papers are kept. They became available in Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. Mr. Bhasin managed to get access to them. They were included in his 5-volume documentary study on China. I don't think a whole lot of people got perturbed about it. I'm not saying that declassification should be done wholesale, but there is a whole lot of lethargy and intellectual, how do I put it, anxiety, weakness, inability to take decision that comes in the way of declassification. So first, papers are overclassified in Government of India. Secondly, when it comes to declassification, people are reluctant to take decision. So if we make it, at present, we have no rule that after certain period, 20-year, 30-year, papers will ordinarily get declassified. Even Right to Information Act has exception in case of security, that anything which is, security provision is invoked, RTI, Yash can talk about it with greater authority, but access under RTI is denied. I think we need to get over that kind of mindset. Because otherwise, what will happen? Our researchers, especially when they're working on China for a certain period, will continue to work either on the basis of what is available in Western archives, or sometimes you have excellent papers available in Russian archives, post ex-Soviet Union archives. Even China, in fact, whole lot of papers have been declassified, including, Nian Pu or these chronicles of Mao Zedong, for instance. They have been declassified now. They are available in public domain. Why, as a democratic society, we have to be so conservative in our approach? I think we need to face up to this question.
Thank you very much for that. May I request Ambassador Vijay Nambia to come in? He's been waiting for some time.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Can't see you.
Oh, can you see me too?
Can't see you, but we can.
Oh, that's better. That's all right. Thank you. In fact, let me just add my word of tribute to Bhasin Saab, because of the obviously in the 70s particularly, we used to share the same room together when I was Undersecretary China, and I carry some warm memories of that time. My question is, in fact, I was planning to, obviously Ritusha has given us a very intense kind of theoretical explanation of her argument of moving from source to structure, which is, I think, very important from the point of view of archives. And here, in terms of not just the archives, but the historical division, the point she makes is that everybody has a narrative. The point of opening archives, of having private papers, etc., is to establish a narrative, and that narrative is established in the archives, but the archives contain more than just that narrative, because it normally contains several narratives. And in fact, as it happened, and here the question I ask is, before Bhasin, the historical division, the evolution of the historical division, in fact, is interesting, because the biggest personality in the historical division was Gopal for many years. And there has been not enough reflection, perhaps not enough discussion of the structure of the historical division and its evolution in terms of how it explained Indian foreign policy, particularly China policy. In the earlier years, historical division had a specific purpose, and Gopal did actually use that purpose specifically in terms of the negotiations with, and to build the narrative towards that negotiation. 62 obviously shattered all that, and after that there was not that kind of a thing in terms of the work of the historical division. In some senses, what Gopal did had established, and what the official delegation, the negotiating teams did, established a particular, in a sense, it set those things in stone. And I think it's important to recognize that in some ways, Bhasin came in between and tried to reopen some of those narratives in terms of what the overall records of particularly on China, seem to suggest. And he did it very carefully. He did it with great trepidation, and of course, obviously the official secrets acts and things like that were also involved. But in that sense, as Ritusha says, he did come in a sense at a particular inflection point. And perhaps it is important for us to see from the point of view of that there is no fixed sort of repository of, as she says, you need to build further and now perhaps build an argument for moving further into a third stage, as it were, of liberating the archives and, in fact, bringing a little more of what was the sources at that time, and now build a bit of structure. And in the process, I think some of the things which Kishan said that actually took place in respect to the Churchill archives, it's exactly the question of not handing in some parts of the story and keeping some parts of the story, in a sense, effectively concealed. This is actually a problem which historians in the future will face, and I think we'll have to come clean in terms of our records if we are to. And I think it is important. Of course, I don't think the current political environment may be altogether right, but somebody has to start this kind of narrative, some building of a narrative. I don't know if any of the speakers would be willing to comment on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very worthwhile and relevant comment, also picking up from Ritusha and the other discussions. Now, I believe there are some more questions in the chat box. Could someone please, Harita, could you read out any, please?
So the one more question, it's from Nazir Khan. The question goes, what are the attributes of excellent archival practices across time and space in an ever-changing world?
Now, who would that be directed to? Ambassador Rana, would you like to come in? I think that's very much your theme. Archives per se.
I honestly don't know what would be the optimum way of handling archives, because there is an interplay between what is important in terms of state secrecy, in terms of safeguarding information, and making things public. I have not handled a responsible position in the East Asia division or in the China division, much less in the Ministry of External Affairs, to be able to really comment on that. But generally speaking, the more open we are, the better things are. But that's very general and perhaps not firm enough. Maybe T.C.A. Raghavan has a comment on that. Thank you.
Well, if I may,
yes.
This is not rocket science. I mean, the Indian Ministry of External Affairs is possibly the only major foreign office in the world today which does not have a historical division. And the point which Ambassador Nambiar made is a valid one, that how did the historical division evolve? When it was first set up in 1948, the Ministry of External Affairs, along with the then Federal Service Public Commission, actually carried out a kind of a headhunt to see who would be the best person to head it, and they identified Mr. Zakaria, who was a former professor of history of Calcutta University, to head it. And when one looks at the files of that period, you get the sense that the historical division, through most of the 1950s, was a kind of in-house think tank. And it functioned a great deal in consultation with the then Indian Council of World Affairs, but at a time when inputs into government policy making from outside the government were limited, having historians who were not trained diplomats but nevertheless had a perspective on international affairs was a useful input into policy making. Now, I think after the China debacle, the historical division itself went into a kind of cloud, and then for various administrative reasons, it was wound up in the 1980s. But the point about how does the Ministry of External Affairs handle its very rich historical documentation, there is no way out except to have a institutional system within the ministry to handle this, because it cannot be outsourced given the nature of the material to any other body. So I think at some stage we will have to revisit that decision of winding up the historical division. It cannot obviously be started off in the same way. You can't just simply pick up old threads, but some thought will have to go into how does the Ministry of External Affairs construct a bridge between its documentation and having an archive which is accessible by scholars.
Well, thank you very much for that comment. We have been talking about the contribution of Bhasin to India's foreign policy. But I wonder why we're only talking about the Ministry of External Affairs here. For instance, would there be relevant archives in the Finance Ministry, in the Home Ministry, or in some other ministries that one couldn't name? Even though we're talking now about international affairs, are there other possible repositories of very useful information? That was just throwing out. There's one question here from Mantosh Singh. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. And it's not a question. I just wanted to say a word of thanks. I'm Mr. Bhasin's son. And I'm on behalf of the family. I just want to extend a word of thanks to the organization that's organizing this, as well as to all the speakers. We really appreciate this. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Mantosh Singh. I think we haven't dealt in some ways with our hero, if you like, as a person. One thing that always that struck me in this, because he was interested in the neighborhood, he did many volumes on Pakistan. But when I was thinking about his biography, there is one book that he did which drew my attention. And that is one which is a collection of articles published from that were published, I think, in one of the Indian newspapers, and that came out as a book called "Some Called It Partition, Some Freedom." This book is now out of print, but it does seem to be a personal memoir as well as a political and geopolitical one. And I was personally very struck by this because our Ambassador Bhasin was exactly the same age as my late husband, had similarly come from Pakistan, and from what is now Pakistan, West Punjab, and one recalls a time when people of this vintage, if they ever met each other in any public place without further introduction, they quickly said to each other, "On what date did you leave Pakistan?" Or rather, they would say Lahore or this or that other place. "What was the date in which you left?" And if anyone then gave a year and a month, or the month, a whole story would open up transparently, because all of them knew what they were talking about, and which in this book now out of print by Bhasin, which he must have written as a labor of love and of faith and of self-identity as a West Punjab Sikh, it really must be something that we should also look at when we're talking about his contribution. What date did you leave Punjab and come to the East Punjab? So I think we will have to close down soon. Are there any very pressing problems or final comments that people want to make? Harita, you're looking at the chat box. Anything? Or we should wind up, I think. Yeah.
There's one more question in the chat box, which is from Venkatraman KK.
Yeah.
Why do we miss out on the MOD archives and those of the Indian Armed Forces when we discuss China and 1962?
That's a good question. Follows up from my asking, there were other ministries beside MEA. Let's also wonder what's in their archives. Can we have the panelists respond to that as a final thought?
If I could come in on that,
Yeah.
Patricia, that has been a problem that there are some reports, documents which were deemed so sensitive by Ministry of Defense that they were not even shared with Ministry of External Affairs, but shared with one particular journalist. And here I'm referring to Henderson Brooks Bhagat report in MEA. We don't have a copy of that report. There are other key documents which were examined but not cleared for publication. That includes MOD and Army headquarters. They have history of various conflicts. So the history of border conflict, the India-China border conflict, 1962. It was prepared. It was even referred to Ministry of External Affairs. We found a lot of problems with that, including factual inaccuracies, assessment contained there. A review was sought, which was not carried out. I understand that that is available on a very restricted basis, but not available in public domain. I can give you these two examples, but I suspect, as Yash brought out earlier, this problem of government entities not wishing to share information is endemic. This is not something which is peculiar or unique to Ministry of External Affairs. And MOD also tends to be rather conservative when it comes to declassifying material.
Well, I think on that note, and with thanks to everyone, we should probably wind up now. But I must say that it's been an extremely rich discussion, multi-layered, many themes, and a lot, and has shown us that we have a lot more to learn in the way of archiving and about the resources that can be at hand. And also, I would like to reiterate the thanks given or the tribute made to Bhasin himself for actually making his archives available and free. There are no words in which one one just can't acknowledge this amount of generosity, of spirit, and of just of spirit and of vision for the future and for a younger generation. I might say that I thank the family also for coming and sharing this moment with us. And I hope that there will be occasions for further interaction, further getting to know him better. Now, I think we must call an end to this, but it's been such a very, very rich discussion. So much has been opened up, And I think there'll be much more to do coming out of this. So thank you to the ICS team, to all the speakers, to all those who've intervened. Over to Harita. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. With this, we come to the end of today's special panel discussion. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to our panelists, Ambassador Kishan Rana, Ambassador Ashok Kantha, Ambassador Yash Sinha, Ambassador TCA Raghavan, Professor Joe Thomas Karakat, Professor Avijit Banerjee, and Dr. Rityusha Mani Tiwari for their rich and insightful contributions. We also extend our sincere thanks to Professor Oberoi for chairing this session, and a special thank you to the audience who joined us today. The recording of today's session will be made available on the ICS YouTube channel. Details about all upcoming events can be found on the ICS's website, or you can subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you once again and have a pleasant day.